This is the MyHeart.net podcast. This show is produced by Dr. Philip Johnson in conjunction with VitalEngine.com. Please welcome your host, Dr. Alain Bouchard of Cardiology Specialists of Birmingham, Alabama, at St. Vincent's Medical Center, part of Ascension.
Welcome to our podcast, now focus on nutrition. And we called it the alphabet soup of the American diet. And, with us, we have a special guest. She knows everything that there is to know about nutrition. I think she's terrific. She's young and dynamic. Her name is Danielle Belardo. She's a cardiologist in Newport Beach in California. And she's co-chair of the nutrition committee for the Society of Preventive Cardiology. And Danielle, we want to thank you for being part of this podcast and help us diffusing the confusion.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's such an honor. I'm so excited to be able to talk to you today about one of my favorite topics.
Great. We know that heart-healthy diet has been the cornerstone of atherosclerotic and cardiovascular disease prevention and treatment for decades. There are significant challenges to establishing the scientific evidence based in nutrition, in part because of the complex interplay between nutrients and confounding by the healthy lifestyle behaviors associated with dietary habits, as well as several nutritional studies funded or influenced by the food industry, and studies relying on the memory of food intake. In the meantime, there's several controversial dietary patterns, foods, and nutrients that have received significant media exposure and are mired by hype. In an attempt to reduce the confusion, we have here Danielle, who maybe can help us, talk about some definition as well as some discussion. And let's start, Danielle, by discussing maybe the micronutrients that we have, the carbs, the fat, and the protein. What are we talking about? What's the good? What's the bad?
Well, I appreciate you framing that in terms of the complexity of nutrition science, because you're right. We don't always get, as clean of data as we do in other studies when we're studying medications or other sorts of interventions. And the reason is because there is no placebo in nutrition, right? Because you're always thinking about, well, what are you replacing something else with? Because everyone has to eat to live. And so it is a little more complex. So whenever I look at nutrition science and our recommendations and our guidelines as a whole, which our cardiology guidelines, I think, are phenomenal and really up to date with the nutrition science, is that, we have to look at it in terms of multiple levels of evidence. So everything from randomized controlled trials, but also we have to take into part epidemiology and prospective cohort studies and taking everything into account, multiple levels of evidence. I think that's really what our nutrition guidelines came about. And so it is complex. And so it's obviously, me and you have mentioned we could have a 5-hour conversation about this, but I think that just starting with the basics of macronutrients. So, most foods have some component of carbohydrates, protein, and fat. And unfortunately, depending on which diet guru you're listening to that day, one of each could get demonized. There's actually people who think all fat is terrible for you, and they use this misnomer, which is not correct, called the fat you eat is the fat you wear, which is not accurate. And then there's people who think all carbohydrates are bad for you. So, that even an apple or a pear is bad for you. And of course, obviously, we know that is incorrect. And then protein, of course, when we think of protein sources, especially, so I happen to be vegan, but people also, there's a misnomer that we only get protein in animal products. And so protein, which is made up of amino acids, we can get from anything, including plants. And so those basics, fundamentals of nutrition are important to understand, that all of the extremes only have a hair of truth to them.
If we talk about carbs, for example, obviously we have some good carbs and we have some that are not so good, particularly the refined sugar. Can you kind of explain to us, what are the carbs that we should be careful of watching? And
yeah, so some of the carbohydrates that are less healthful would be things like refined sugar. So anything that's refined. So we're thinking candies, chocolates, especially sodas. I always say drinkable calories are some of the most challenging that are added to our patients' diets because they may not realize that they're added, but they're actually one of the easiest to replace. Drinking sodas, any sort of beverages, even something that sneaks in there that's a refined carbohydrate is when people get even coffee drinks at Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks. Those can be filled with refined sugar. Also, when we think of refined carbohydrates, we're thinking of white bread, not whole grain items. We're thinking of white bread, muffins, cookies, pastries, cakes, ice cream, stuff like that. But mind you that those refined carbs, a lot that I just mentioned, also have fat in them as well. So a donut has a lot of refined sugar, but also fat as well, more like saturated fat, trans fat, things like that. So no food lives in isolation unless it's pure table sugar, all carbs. So for example, people may say, well, lentils, those are high in carbs. Correct, but they're also really high in protein and fiber. So there's different kinds of carbs. So for refined carbs, we're looking for things that are more processed. And just to differentiate in the beginning, I always like to say this. I refer to two different kinds of processed foods. There's ultra processed or smartly processed, because not all processing of food is bad. But the ultra processed kind of refined carb foods we're trying to avoid. But the healthful carb foods, that carb heavy foods that we are trying to encourage our patients to eat, are things like non-starchy vegetables and starchy vegetables, as well as fruits, whole grains, legumes, things like that, tofu, tempeh, different various foods. All plant foods generally have a higher amount of carbohydrates, but also they have fiber, and fiber only exists in plant foods.
We talk also about glycemic index. Can you touch briefly on that?
Sure, yeah. So glycemic index is a measure of how essentially bioavailable the glucose is in an item once you eat it, and it's based on the digestion time. And essentially something gets assigned a lower glycemic index if it's usually got higher fiber and a lower amount of just bioavailable glucose. And so when you're eating something that's really high fiber, it will actually take more time for digestion in your body, and it'll have a slower release of glucose in your bloodstream because the fiber extends digestion.
So those very high glycemic index, these refined sugar will just kind of trigger the spike of glucose in your bloodstream, and then have this huge insulin you kind of release, and eventually over the years we'll just develop this insulin resistant and make us fattier, right? And particularly abdominal fat.
Yeah, so insulin resistance actually, so even if you ate a pure sugar diet, so it wouldn't be helpful to eat a pure sugar diet, but insulin resistance, and there's still so much we don't know about it, but insulin resistance we're finding more and more is really, especially for type 2 diabetes, is really related to weight. So there's many ways in which, whether or not you're at a calorie excess from eating meat, or whether you're at a calorie excess from eating bread, or whether you're at a calorie excess from all sort of foods, that can really increase the amount of insulin resistance when there's excess adiposity. So you're thinking of fat that gets into the muscle cells, fat that gets into the cells throughout the body and the liver and everything like that. But that being said, eating these refined sugar foods, they don't make you feel full, right? So they don't give you any satiety, and they're very easy to eat a lot of. So if you're eating, when we think of what keeps someone full, you think of some of these carbohydrate foods that have a lot of satiety to them. So Barbara Rolls did a great study on this. Actually, one food that doesn't even have a ton of fiber, but one food that really helps with satiety is actually even potatoes. She did a large study on this where she was looking at the satiety of different foods, and a baked potato had one of the highest satiety in the whole study. And then also a lot of plant foods with volume. So if you're looking at, a lot of leafy greens with cruciferous vegetables, with all sorts of vegetables, that's mostly carbohydrates, but it's also a lot of water and volume that keeps you full. Whereas drinking a 2,000 calorie soda is so easy to do. Any of us could do that. but it doesn't keep you full. It doesn't give you any nutrients, and it doesn't give you any, essentially any health benefits. So over time, it's super, super detrimental to health.
I used to work with a nutritionist, and she always kind of picture the calories in packets of sugar, which I thought was very, very helpful. For example, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe a packet of sugar that we put in a coffee is about 4 grams of sugar. So if you look at the calories in a regular Coke, for example, of 160 calories, it's about 10 packs of sugar. Now, who would put that much sugar in their coffee?
And
right?
Many people drink just a regular can. It's usually these large servings.
Even worse.
Of the sodas that can, and some of these drinks, that's why I always say these drinkable sugary drinks. There's all these diet wars that people argue over, Mediterranean versus plant-based, for all these things. For me, I always say the best thing we can do is get just our patients to cut back and eliminate these sugary drinks. You can actually have just one of these sugary coffees at Dunkin' Donuts that can be 700 to 900 calories. A large big gulp soda can be, 1,000 calories, just pure sugar. And so that's low hanging fruit to help our patients make a switch that can make a huge difference.
Very good. Now, let's talk about the fat. And we'll talk about, maybe tell us a bit about the good fat, the bad fat, and the real ugly fat.
So the good fat. So as anyone listening to this, depending on what you've heard about nutrition before, sometimes fat gets demonized too, and that is certainly not necessary. We have a lot of research that there are healthful fats. So one of the more healthful fats that we know of is unsaturated fat. So either poly or monounsaturated fat. Polyunsaturated fat can actually help to lower your LDL cholesterol. Actually, and when it comes to nutrition science, saturated versus polyunsaturated versus monounsaturated fat versus carbohydrates on lipoproteins like ApoB and LDL cholesterol is one of the most robustly studied things we have. From over 386 metabolic ward studies we have, which is where people get locked at the NIH. They voluntarily get locked and they live there for a few weeks, and every single thing that comes in and out of their mouth is measured, counted, it's strategically done. And then their lipoproteins are followed. So we do know that if you're eating more polyunsaturated fats, so that's things like nuts, seeds, chia, flax, fish, those sorts of fats, olive oil, those help to lower your LDL cholesterol, whereas saturated fat, so we see saturated fat more in butter, red meats, actually even lean meats, but less so, but red meats, and in a lot of processed foods and cheese, things like that. Saturated fat actually increases your ApoB lipoprotein, which is, for any of your listeners that may not know, that's one of the bad lipids that we don't want to increase. It causes heart disease. And monounsaturated fat, with regards to lipids, seems to just be neutral. But saturated fat is something we want to avoid. So we actually have our current American College of Cardiology and AHA nutrition recommendation is to keep saturated fat low and have a moderate, and replace that with a moderate amount of polyunsaturated fat. So focusing on eating things like nuts, seeds, and fish, if you eat animal products, fish, and trying to stay away from the high saturated fat. And then the worst kind of fat, which we want our patients to limit as much as possible, is trans fat. And trans fat, thankfully, is becoming far less common, but we see that in fried foods, in foods that are fast food, in super ultra processed foods, chips, things like that.
Donuts.
Yes.
In the South, they have this donut burger. I can't even fathom. How did they come up with this?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. What about in the polyunsaturated fat? We have also the omega-3 and we have the omega-6. Omega-6 is not as good, is it?
Well, so omega-6 gets a bad rap, but some things that are higher in omega-6 are still really good for you. Like almonds are actually higher in omega-6. Peanuts are higher in omega-6. These things are still good for you. Omega-3s are certainly important. And so your best sources for omega-3s are going to be fatty fish, cold water fish, foods like that. As well. So things like salmon, mackerel. But if you are plant-based like me, I get a lot of my omega-3s from chia, flax, walnuts, different nuts and seeds. And also like different algae, kind of seaweed, fortified foods, things like that. But yeah, if you eat a omnivore diet, getting omega-3s from fish is a great source. But that being said, I wouldn't be scared of omega-6s. There's plenty of healthy foods that are higher in omega-6s than they are in omega-3s. And regardless, all of the polyunsaturated fats certainly much better for us than the saturated fat.
Very good. Let's finish with the protein. We have obviously the plant-based protein, the animal protein. We talk about this. And also we talk a little bit about some of the processed food, where unfortunately it's very popular in the South, and we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later, as well as not only Southern, cooking, but also the great Cajun cooking and, in Louisiana, and some of the Western style. Let's talk about protein for a second.
Protein. So protein's made up of amino acids, and everyone's always so concerned for us vegans that we don't get enough protein, but there certainly is protein in plants. Actually, the animals you eat that get protein are actually getting those proteins from eating other plants as well. So you can get protein in a range of variety of items, whether it be plant items or animal-based items. And so for plant-based forms, the best part about plant-based forms of protein is that they include fiber. Fiber is super powerful to help reduce risk for certain kinds of cancers, helps with you feeling more full. And fiber also helps to lower your cholesterol because it binds bile in the GI system and helps to decrease the amount of cholesterol in your body. But fiber only comes in plants. So plant-based proteins, the ones that are high in protein are often actually really high in fiber. And the most bang for your buck is legumes. So beans are phenomenal for you. The longest living populations in the world always eat a good sizable amount of legumes. So lentils, beans of any kind, chickpeas, black beans, any sort of bean, super high in protein. Additionally, other great sources of protein is soy. There's a lot of misinformation there about soy with men's health, that it's acts as an estrogen, which is not true at all. Soy is perfectly healthy at all stages of life for both men and women. It doesn't mimic estrogen whatsoever in the doses that we eat soy, even if you eat a ton of soy. And soy is great because it contains a lot of lysine. There's actually been a lot of research, which is a lysine an amino acid. There's been a lot of research that if you get 10% of your protein with lysine, then actually the muscle building for someone eating fully plant-based versus someone eating omnivorous diet's identical. There's no difference in muscle developing. So eating soy, which has a lot of lysine, and then eating things like tofu, tempeh, other sorts of things that have great protein, or even whole grains have a great amount of protein, quinoa. And then every vegetable you eat actually has some amount of protein. So even broccoli and stuff like that. And so you can get protein from a variety of plants. And actually, one little hack that I'd recommend your listeners try that I've been getting everyone onto is they've actually now made pastas out of legumes. There's all these legume pastas, and one serving of one of these legume pastas, some of the brands I buy, I'm not affiliated with them, but are Bonza, Explore, just for 1 8-ounce serving, you can get, I think it's like 23 grams of protein plus, 20 grams of fiber. It's unbelievable. A great way to get protein in your diet. So that's another source too. And then for people who eat dairy, things like Greek yogurt have great protein source too, and super low in fat and low in calorie. And then for animal-based protein sources, fish is really one of the healthiest because, as we mentioned, it's got the good kind of fat. Interestingly enough, Ron Krauss did a study on lipoproteins and different kinds of protein and to see what would happen. And he actually randomized people to lean meat, so like a white meat versus red meat versus a plant protein. And he controlled for saturated fat content for each, and did a low saturated fat arm and a high saturated fat arm. And he actually did a randomized control trial with a washout and a crossover. And what they found was that regardless of saturated fat content, it was actually equal. The lean meat and the red meat had the exact same elevation of your bad cholesterol, the LDL cholesterol and the ApoB lipoproteins. The only time that the cholesterol dropped was in the plant-based arm, the plant-based protein arm. So when it comes to lipoproteins, just making sure you get as low saturated fat as possible, which is mostly in fish. And if you do eat other sort of lean proteins like chicken, things like that, that's certainly better, but it still can raise your LDL cholesterol the same depending on how much.
So I'm sorry. Yeah, that does well. What do you say, a healthy diet should be composed of in terms of like percentage of carb versus, fat versus protein?
That's a great question. I actually think we worry too much about macronutrient profile with regards to the commonly discussed different dietary paradigms, and less about macronutrient, about the food quality. Meaning, you can eat, a low carb diet that's entirely unhealthy, that's just from processed meats and meats that will raise your cholesterol and meats that will put you at risk for colon cancer. Or you could eat a high carb diet that's totally plant-based, but that's vegan and entirely unhealthy. Oreos and French fries are vegan, right? So there's actually, diet quality is so much more important, because you can actually make any dietary paradigm, whether it's a low carb diet, a moderate carb diet, or a high carb diet, you can make any of them healthful. It's just focusing on the dietary quality is most important.
I think that's a very good point. And we'll come back to that, later on, quality over quantity. But, in the United States, it's all about the quantity and all we can get for as little as possible. Somehow we need to get more of a European kind of an aspect of, in the food, with the freshness of the produce and, and so forth, and make it more enjoyable and decrease, some of the side effects of that quantity, which is obesity and diabetes and so forth. Well, obviously there's growing consensus that predominantly plant-based diet that emphasize green leafy vegetables, whole grain, legumes, and fruit is where the best improvement in cardiovascular event that we've seen in the trial. But, unfortunately, we have over 80% of the population that eats less than the recommended amount of vegetables, and we have more than 70% that eat more of the amount of saturated fat, salt, and sugar. So, I think we have some work to do, and maybe we could kind of dissect a little bit some of the different diets, explain to them, a little bit what they are and how they can affect you, your health, and you as a person. So, I thought maybe we could start with the vegetarian diet, because, here we are with, with you, Danielle, a specialist in that. But also what's kind of interesting is some very, very interesting cohort studies. And I think one of the one that I want to start with, and I think Dr. Kim Williams, also who used to be one of your mentors, likes to mention that cohort study that, by Gary Fraser, who enrolled about over 96,000 people in churches, in the US as well as in Canada, and really looked at their dietary patterns and then looked at their weight using the BMI, and looked at the incidence of diabetes and hypertension. And with them, there was about, there was a non-vegetarian, but there's 4 groups of vegetarian. Can you explain to us a little bit what is a pesco-vegetarian, what's a lacto-ovo-vegetarian, and so forth? Maybe explain to us some of the language used and what it means.
Yeah, and I think I love Kim Williams. Yeah, I think you're referring to the Adventist Health cohorts. Yeah. So yes, there's different versions of vegetarian, and there's actually, this may come as a surprise to some of your listeners, but there's actually no official definition of plant-based in the literature. Plant-based can mean plant predominant, or it can mean fully vegan. So when we look at the subcategories, we have just regular vegetarian, which is usually includes, it's eating a lot of plants, abstains from meat and fish and from chicken, things like that, but usually includes dairy, things like cheese and milk. Then you have pesco-vegetarian, which is similar to vegetarian, except it also includes fish. So some people liken a pesco-vegetarian to a similar terminology as a pescatarian. And then you have fully vegan, which is when you abstain from all animal products, so no fish and also no dairy and no eggs or anything like that. And then you have lacto-ovo-vegetarian, which is usually used in overlap with just traditional vegetarian, because oftentimes vegetarian really refers to eating both eggs and dairy as well. So when you look at the Adventist cohort studies, actually, so the Adventists the Seventh-day Adventists is a religion, and part of the religious belief of Seventh-day Adventists is not eating meat. So it's a great cohort to study because they can look at them over time and see how they do, because this is just a way of life for them. And they actually found through the AHS2 study cohort, I remember they found that the vegan groups had the lowest blood pressure, so the lowest incidence of hypertension, the lowest incidence of obesity, the lowest incidence of diabetes. And they maintain this throughout life. And actually, on average, Adventist health vegetarians, the group as a whole, actually live 9 years longer than the average Californian. And so it's quite impressive when it comes to both short-term, health conditions, but also longevity. But then again, because it's a cohort study, as you know, people will, of course, claim this is because of healthy user bias. But it's still an interesting cohort.
Makes you want to join the church. So they had a lot of lacto-ovo-vegetarian. That was probably composed, about 34% of their population. The non-vegetarian was about 44%, and the vegan was only like 4%, of their population. It's like, I guess as a vegan, you say it's really a small number of patients. I mean, or a small number of individuals. Probably in the United States, maybe 1% of the population is vegan. Do you estimate?
Yeah, or maybe even less. I think it's growing. I think plant-based products are growing in interest, but going full on vegan, I think is not there yet.
Yeah. Interestingly, they were the only one, they were the main one with the normal BMI of 23, and the non-vegetarian were very close to, they were, obviously overweight with the BMI of 28. Here in the Southeast, obviously it's, we have probably a third of our population that is obese. That means with a BMI of greater than 30. But it's kind of interesting to see all these populations of people, seeing that the more vegetable, and fruit that you were eating, the less, the weight, the less the diabetes, and the less the hypertension. I mean, really kind of phenomenal. Now, obviously, there were some trials that were done, or some experiment using, the vegan diet as the experimental arm. They were mostly kind of case report, to be honest with you. I mean, and some of them, even way back then in 1990s with Dr. Ornish at UCSF and Dr. Esselstyn. I think Dr. Ornish used less than 10%, of fat, and Dr. Esselstyn, it was like zero fat. Yeah. I can imagine myself eating spinach with balsamic vinegar all day. How do you actually do that? I mean, obviously, there were small numbers that they studied. Do you want to tell us a little bit about these studies?
Yeah, absolutely. So Dr. Ornish's study actually looked at a vegetarian diet. It was less than 10% fat. It was a low-fat vegetarian diet, and they supplemented fish oil. Interestingly enough, though, if you actually look at the data of that study, because they used quantitative coronary angiography to evaluate the lesions. And so it wasn't actually until I did cardiology fellowship and did, over 200 caths that I was like, wait a second. And then I looked into the IVUS data, and I found that actually at the point in which they found disease reversal in his study actually doesn't correlate with the change in plaque regression in IVUS. So actually, I do not use the words that you can reverse heart disease with diet, because we actually do not have robust data that shows that. And although I'm a vegan, I try to be incredibly unbiased, and I just like to follow the science. And so we don't truly have plaque regression if you go based on the data we have. But Esselstyn's study was certainly interesting as well. I mean, it was a case control study. There was no control group, sorry. And, he did show that if people adhered to his diet, they had a significant reduction of cardiovascular events. But actually, even for his study, if you actually, when people tried to use that study as a reason why a plant-based diet is superior to Mediterranean diet, in all intellectual honesty, and this is coming from me as a vegan, if you actually take that data, which I've done, and you extrapolate it and you actually compare it because that's a non-adherence study, so they're looking at people that only adhered, and if you actually compared the data and equalized it to the amount you randomized people to, if you made it into a randomized controlled trial and you compare the data to Leo and Heart, it's actually equivalent results. So I actually truly find, to me at this point, the nutrition science really shows a Mediterranean diet is pretty equivalent with a plant-based diet. So I find at this time, since we don't have robust data that shows we can reverse epicardial coronary artery disease, but we do have the amazing results from the Leo and Heart, which I know we're going to talk about. I do think that my advice is just eating more plants, but you don't have to go all the way, I think, is what I can extract from those studies that were done, which really did help to pave the way for studies in the future. And I do hope that eventually we have a coronary CTA or IVUS or OCT study that can evaluate this.
I think that's a very good point. I think they were mostly case reports of their finding using a surrogate, really, because at the end of the day, I mean, how you measure progression or regression is very difficult. And certainly QCA or this coronary angiogram is certainly not the way. At the end of the day, it's like, what are we doing in terms of mortality? The real outcome is what that counts.
Exactly. 100%.
So let's dig into it. I mean, obviously, in the vegan diets, we don't have any randomized controlled trial, but we do have some very interesting cohort studies. That looked at several, thousands of patients and looked at outcome. We have the ERIC cohort as well as the EPIC cohort. Do you want to discuss that a little bit, Danielle?
Yeah, so the EPIC Oxford cohort, I'm blanking right now. I do feel like that the EPIC Oxford cohort has multiple different sects, right? They have Greek, or they have French, so I do feel like it depends on the area. I remember, if I could be remembering this off, but
it had like over 500,000 people from all over, but about 30% of them, were vegan.
Yeah.
But they did find some decreased BMI in these patients. They did find some lower blood pressure and maybe 30% reduction in events. So it made it kind of interesting.
There was in one of the arms, I forget if it was the Greek one or whichever one, there was one of the arms where the pesco vegetarians did a little bit better than the vegans. And then there were some where vegans did better, which to my recollection really just goes to show that they're really kind of, it's.
Yeah, it's a very small difference. How about in the ERIC? It was about 12,000 people that they looked. So a bit smaller study, a cohort that was done, between 1987 and 2016. And they looked at high adherence, to healthy plant diet was associated with less cardiovascular mortality, like almost 20%, less. But I don't know much about, how else to dissect that.
Yeah, prospective cohorts. So then again, so the biggest critique of these prospective cohorts is that, the nutrition information is extracted from food frequency questionnaires, things like that. So people say that it's not as accurate. Although, for me, that's where we go back to the complexity of nutrition science in the beginning. And we say, well, these cohorts are one piece to the level of evidence of the puzzle. And then we're going to get to the randomized controlled trials, which actually give us some really good information.
Yeah, I think that's so difficult, Danielle. It's like, that's why you can talk about, dietary patterns, because you don't eat food just by itself. You eat you don't eat just the protein by itself. It's what do you eat it with, and there's some fat associated with it, some carbs associated with it. Different foods, go well together. So, the vegan, I think, is interesting. And, I think it has a lot of very, very good data. Let's talk about the Mediterranean diet, because, it has, it's been, studied. Thousands of patients have entered, some clinical trials. And you mentioned the Lyon heart study, which was a secondary prevention trial, patients that have suffered a cardiovascular event, whether it was a heart attack or, had some coronary disease. Tell us a bit about that.
Lyon Heart's one of my favorite studies. I think it's incredibly interesting because what they did in this is a randomized controlled trial, and it was looking at heart outcomes. So it was looking at cardiovascular events, heart attack, MI, stroke, hospitalizations. It was looking at heart events. And it was in people that have previous cardiovascular disease. And the intervention of the trial, although it's called a Mediterranean style diet, but actually what the intervention of the trial is that if you actually look, I have this in all of my grand rounds presentations, is the slide of what the actual intervention was. The intervention of the trial was they had a statistically significant, they asked the experimental group to have, compared to baseline, it was an increase in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, and it was a decrease in red meat, processed meat, butter. Dairy stayed the same, and fish stayed about the same. And they decreased butter almost, so significantly, and then they replaced it with a margarine, a polyunsaturated fat-based margarine. But it was really a study of, truthfully, it was a study of what happens when you increase fruits, vegetables, whole grains, bread, actually, whole grain breads, and you replace butter with a polyunsaturated fat margarine. What happens when you change saturated fat to unsaturated fat and you increase fiber in plant foods? And the results were astonishing. I mean, they had 50 to 70% reduction of cardiovascular events by 6 months, and it was phenomenal. And then whenever people discuss healthy user bias with regards to the Adventist health studies, I always come back to the Lyon Heart study, because the most phenomenal thing about Lyon Heart is that the experimental group had more smokers. So they actually had more smokers in the experimental group. But despite that, despite having more smokers, they had 50 to 70% less cardiac events from just eating a more plant-forward diet and reducing red meat and butter and saturated fat.
Yeah, it was very powerful, the Lyon part, or Lyon
Yeah.
part. That's why you had a lot of smokers, in France. It's still a problem. Now let's talk about primary prevention. Let's talk about a PREDIMED, study, which is kind of interesting because it has also some controversies. The way the method, there was some problem in methodology and randomization. But let's talk about that. Tell us about PREDIMED.
So PREDIMED does have some, there was a retraction, and then they ended up coming back and republishing it because of, like you had mentioned, there was questions with regards to the randomizations within certain families. And so PREDIMED's interesting because, it's an interesting study because they call it a Mediterranean diet, but you're actually from Europe, correct?
Well, more for Canada.
Oh, yeah. So, I thought actually from
but
Europe.
My ancestors are.
So, it's one of those things where they called it a Mediterranean diet, but it's actually, really they were just adding supplementing olive oil and nuts, which is part of a Mediterranean diet. And I think they encouraged wine and chocolate, I think, for the intervention arm, something similar to that. But they did have the reduction in, I believe it was, I think if they looked at the post hoc analysis of PREDIMED, the only group that had a mortality reduction was the pro-vegetarian subpattern of the PREDIMED study. So the ones who had eliminated animal products that were supplementing with olive oil and nuts. But overall, PrediMed, it certainly had its issues, although I give them credit for doing, it was a very large randomized controlled nutrition trial, and they supplied the olive oil and the food. So I think they were liberalized to like a gallon of olive oil a week or something quite high, right?
Which is pretty incredible when you consider how many calories there is in olive oil. I mean, I never realized that a little tablespoon of olive oil is like 120 calories.
Totally.
So you can imagine. But, it did show some decrease, in myocardial infarction, about 30%, as well as, 30% reduction of stroke. Pretty remarkable. Adding nuts and adding olive oil and to a plant forward, diet. It's pretty over 5,000 patients. But, it's Mediterranean, right? So you have some fish, you have some cheese, you have some wine in moderation, but you have a lot of, fruit and vegetable and legumes, which is a big part, and a lot of fibers. So we talked about the vegetarian diet. We talked about the Mediterranean diet. There is a diet that is making a lot of, that is very popular, is making a lot of headlines, and it's the paleo diet, which is, it is so misrepresented. I mean, you look in the paleo diet, and they always show this guy, with these abs, coming out eating these 5, slices of steak. Yeah. And I mean, in the paleo diet, obviously it's anything but the truth. I mean, if anything, there was probably a lot of diversity in what they ate, and also probably a lot of sparsity. And they sure didn't have steaks, but they probably, some of the meat they ate was like quail and dove and turtles. But mostly it was a lot of berries and fruit, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I did an ACC debate on plant-based versus paleo, and it was funny because I kept saying, why are we trying to model a diet after ancestors that lived to 30? I mean, it's so funny. That's not a time period that I admire. So I just think, but so paleo to me is funny. It's got some things right, I think, in that similar to a lot of the other dietary patterns, which I think are helpful, is that it does emphasize fruits and vegetables, leafy greens, and cutting out these processed foods, which is super important. And I do think that that's a step up. It's a step of improvement, at least, because it's recommending, cutting out the sodas and the cakes and the cookies and things like that. Some forms of paleo have a strange grouping where they're anti-legumes, and that is just unscientific to me, and based on really no research. It's just based on a hypothesized mechanism that because you have to boil them, that there's an issue with legumes being an anti-nutrient, which is just not true. It's some of the most healthful foods that we have. And so I think paleo has some things right. Some things are off, but and also there's all sorts of various kinds of paleo. And I think that to me, it's more of just a marketing tool. It's not even necessarily, it's just a way that people are marketing a diet. It's, so.
I think one of the best picture was this advertisement for paleo chocolate cake.
Oh.
Certainly, the what is being claimed or publicized certainly has no basis in archaeological records. There's even actually some vegetable food processing that was found in archaeological finds 30,000 years ago. So it's possible that they even had maybe some practice of possibly making some flour, even, way back then. So it's really kind of interesting, the paleo. Well, I thought, I'm in the South and, we have a Southern diet. I thought maybe we could kind of complete this podcast by discussing a little bit about the Southern diet and, what kind of damage, it can do, for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that a lot of the, you would actually know better than me, but a lot of what's typical with the Southern diet is a lot of fried foods. So you take healthy foods and you will fry them, even fried vegetables, fried, fish, fried chicken, sort of lots of frying of foods, which we know adds, more fat and makes any sort of protein more unhealthful, as well as a lot of butter-based creams, butter-based breads, butter-based pastries, butter-based sauces in general, a lot of high-fat sauces. And I think what's tough is that, especially when you're working in populations where this is a cultural norm, it's really about, for me, it's meeting patients where they're at and trying to find small changes they can make that can make a big impact, rather than getting every patient I meet to follow a Mediterranean or plant-based diet, because culturally that may not fit with their lifestyle, but we do have to try to find some common ground of small changes they can make, like cutting out any beverages that have calories, literally just a switch to diet soda, or instead of having fried fish or fried items, make it steamed. And cutting out the butters and sauces and switching it with a polyunsaturated, something like olive oil, is, it's tough though. And for you, I've never worked in the South, so I do imagine for you, how do you approach that with patients?
That's a very, very good question. But that's also why we're so busy in the South, right? We have about 30% of our population that is obese. We have also, if we count also the overweight and obese, that's 70% of the population. And when you look at the Southern diet, which, as you mentioned, it's the added fats. I mean, this is like the bacon, added to the greens. So the leafy vegetables, unfortunately, get transformed into something that is totally unhealthy. You have the fried food that you mentioned. You have the eggs and the egg dishes, the organ meat, and the processed meat, as well as a big part is the sugary, sweetened, beverages, which is really kind of a big one. And there was actually a very interesting study done by Dr. Shikari at UAB, and that was the REGARD study. It was a study that was, there was, I think, something like 17,000 participants from all over the United States, and they looked at different, different diets, patterns. Some were convenience diets, some were plant-based, some were the Southern, and some with alcohol and salad. It was kind of interesting, showing that the Southern diet really won. Unfortunately, that's not something you want to win, but it had 53% increase in acute cardiac event over a period of 5 to 8 years. So it's pretty tremendous. I mean, it's really something that we have to address here in the South, and it's a culture, and it's not easy to change that. But I think you, as a first part, if you just kind of cut down those sweetened beverages, I think you've accomplished, probably quite a bit. And talking about the processed food, how bad, can it be? It's the bacon, the sausage, the hot dogs. I had a gumbo today, and it had this beautiful and tasty andouille sausage, in it. This is what we find a lot, in New Orleans and in the South, all over. And they make it, this processed food, they make it so tasty. They make it is so much flavor that you're addicted. And it's not like you're going to stop at one piece,
There's all these ideas of, why do hyper palatable processed foods make us eat more of it? And, people have all these different hypotheses. Is it the insulin? Is it the glucose? Is it the carbs, et cetera? At the end of the day, a lot of research is just finding it's that eating food that tastes good makes us feel good, right? In that moment, and you just want to eat more of it. And so changing the actual food environment, obesity isn't the fault of the individual necessarily. It's really, you put anyone in a food environment where they're surrounded by these amazing, hyper palatable, tasty foods. It's really hard to change. And so I think helping our patients to change their own food environment, which of course is hard, because especially if there's a cultural shift, which is why often I think at times it can be helpful to get whole families on board with one family member's change, after, dad has or mom or whoever has a heart attack, getting the whole family to kind of do a shift, because while still remaining culturally sensitive is kind of the direction to go, because it's really hard, especially when the whole community is eating in a certain way.
I agree. Well, we've talked about the vegetarian diet. We talked about the Mediterranean diet, which is probably a very, very important, not only about a diet itself, but it may be even a lifestyle. We talked about the Southern diet and how much, it can cause in terms of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. So I'd like to see maybe if we could follow next time, Danielle, about how do we go about changing, the eating patterns of our patient. What can we teach them sometimes in the brief moment that we have in the office visit? Where do we start? And that's why I'd like to kind of maybe dedicate the next podcast to, what if my patient, how do we tell them, I'd like to lose some weight but I'd like to live also healthy and live a long life. And, we'll talk about calorie restriction. We'll talk about maybe some fasting. We'll talk about low carbs, high fat diet and the type of fat maybe that we need to avoid, like we started mentioning today.
Absolutely. I would love to.
Love to look forward to it and learn from you. And for our patients, really appreciate that, Danielle. Danielle Belardo, cardiologist in California. Thank you, Danielle, for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for it was so fun.
To learn more from our team of cardiologists, please visit us at MyHeart.net. You can also follow us on social media by searching MyHeart.net on Facebook and Twitter. And be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss our next episode.